Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Information on Kuwait and indeed on the whole Arabian Peninsula tends to create a vague perception of an almost mythic past, descending into a statics history which absorbs everything into a monolithic culture. Unfortunately, these generalizations are not only the case in journalism, but also as scholarly studies as well. This evening, in a lecture entitled Between Pluralism and Homogeneity, will present a different, more accurate approach. It deals with the vast diversity of historical and religious traditions that have been present throughout time in what the lecturer calls a fluid plurality. Periodically, historic movements have promoted exclusions of diverse elements into attempts at unification. Nevertheless, diversity regularly reappears. It is with delight that we welcome Dr. Badr Mousa Saif to Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah's yearly cultural series. He himself has a wide background in a diverse fields of study, ranging from law, theology and history, to political science and education. While he focuses on the modern and contemporary history and politics of the Middle East, he also has researched intellectual history, Islamic thought, and done a number of gender studies. Dr. Badr has published many articles and book chapters, particularly through his membership as a non-resident fellow in the Matthew H. Kirk Carnegie Middle East Center. To date, Dr. Badr has not done any research on the problem of mobile phones disturbing lectures, especially a lecture like his. So let's turn them off and let's welcome Dr. Badr Mousa Saif.
شكرا لك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحضور الكرام، ضيوف الدار، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. وأنا معكم اليوم أجد سرورا لا تسعه الكلمات. كما تعلمون فإن الحديث عن التاريخ الفكري والتاريخ الديني بقدر ما هو ممتع هو حديث ذا شجون وشديد الوطأة على الذهن والوقت. لذا أتمنى أن أكون ضيفا خفيف الظل خلال رحلة الحديث. بحسب العادة في كثير من محاضرات الدار سأقدم محاضرتي باللغة الإنجليزية مراعاة لضيوف الدار غير الناطقين بالعربية. It's a pleasure to be among friends and colleagues. As you can tell from the title, I am interested in the role religion plays in the public square. My interest was amateurish at first. I had to take a theology course when I was an undergraduate student at Boston College. Obviously, you cannot graduate from a Jesuit university without having theology under your belt. Little did I know that a one-year course in theology will have such a profound impact on me, on my understanding of Islam and other religions, and on the trajectory of living in a religiously diverse society. That led me to study at the master's level comparative theology, over there. When I went to Harvard to do such a study, it led to a lot of scorn from people and some ridicule and some questions as well. But I moved ahead with the program regardless and was grateful for the opportunity. Being open to a variety of views on different religions and belief systems got me thinking about religion, state, and society and their interaction with one another across the Arabian Peninsula. Several questions guided my research at the time. How does engaging with other religions impact one's belief system? How is Islam consumed and displayed across the Arabian Peninsula? What shape does religious diversity take when it's there but not as readily apparent? I found myself battling opposing ideas, trying to come to terms with a plurality that exists in our region, but not as quite. Understood in our region, but not as quite. Celebrated in our region, but again, not as quite. The not so quite I'm referring to led to a lot of fieldwork, research, and questions. Before delving further, let me try and be a good historian and define the concepts that I'm using. Between pluralism, let me go back to the title. Between pluralism and homogeneity, the management of religious diversity in the Arabian Peninsula. Each concept has its own genealogy and a basket of interpretations. Let me start with diversity. Diversity is simply the existence of multiple views, backgrounds, and in our case, religions. Think of religious variety as de facto present. Difference is the main feature of diversity. Our response to diversity, however, is what produces pluralism or homogeneity. Pluralism takes diversity deeper. It is an active engagement with difference. And that would be done for truly understanding one another and discovering constructive ways of living together. Adopting religious pluralism doesn't mean dropping one's religious beliefs or watering them down to accommodate others. Actually, adopting pluralism does the opposite. It allows individuals, whether believers or not, to better understand their belief systems in relation to other beliefs. Doing that has a potential to breaking layers of ignorance and eventually incubating healthier societies. Homogeneity is the opposite. It takes sameness as a stance, as a reality. You can even see it as a value for some, thereby diluting differences. Globalization may have pushed the sameness envelope in various fields, but sameness cannot be pushed on unique belief systems that believe in their right to exist as they deem fit. Homogeneity may have reflected a lived reality in certain societies at one point, but it was never a Middle Eastern reality where difference is really ingrained in our DNA. It is this difference that various scholars have identified in their works. Lawrence Potter describes the Arabian Peninsula as a Creole area, an area of mixed descent. If you ask an average Arabian Peninsula resident about the region, these descriptors will seldom come to mind. Yet, various ethnicities, religions, sects, and backgrounds coexist in the Arabian Peninsula. My argument tonight is twofold. Attitudes towards religious diversity have moved through three stages. First, there was fluid plurality, which was second nature in the region in the past. It was characterized by a nonchalant spirit. Second, plurality took a backseat when emerging nation-states linked themselves to an exclusive rendition of Islam that silenced or erased other strands within Islam and other religions. That took place along two contrasting modes. It was done on purpose at times, and it was unintentional at many other times, all for the sake of building a distinct national identity that citizens coalesce around. This led to a modern manufactured homogeneous identity, one that pits those who do not subscribe or acquiesce to it as the other that needs to be symbolically subdued or disciplined. Third, plurality makes a curious comeback today, but it does so through an ambivalent attitude that mixes traces of the more open past with remnants of the guarded attitude of the modern era. And that is where my second argument enters. The select ongoing attempts at reconstituting the region as religiously pluralistic is welcome. but of little value absent a systematic cultivation of religious pluralism in critical fields like education, media, law, and civil society. I will now summarize select scholarly understandings of the region's diversity before conceptualizing erasure and the subaltern as two methods that help explain the differential silencing of religious plurality in the Arabian Peninsula. I will then highlight divergent facets of the region's religious diversity in the past before revealing select modern attempts at silencing and otherwise apparent diversity. I then end with recommendations for nurturing religious pluralism, which has the potential to be one of the region's soft powers. Scholars neither deny nor shy away from pointing only the systemic attempts at eradicating plurality for the sake of building a teleological, unitary model vision of the Arabian Peninsula resident. By resident, I adopt a wide-ranging unit of analysis. And here I include anyone that has an integral role to play in society, whether it's men, women, citizens, Bedouin, long-term residents, migrants, or transit inhabitants. Each contributes to the region's plural makeup. So what does the literature say? David Cummins centralizes diversity in his survey work on the region. He notes three deeply ingrained tendencies in the Gulf: migration, a polyglot population, and important trading networks. The mixing of people and cultures throughout the region's history has resulted in a hybrid society, considered cosmopolitan long before the evolution of nation-states or even the exploration of oil. Scarce resources, coupled with a quest for better living standards, have pulled disparate people together and positioned the region as a space that absorbs outsiders, or to be more accurate, a space that blurs the line between outsiders and insiders. People from different walks of life have become valid constituents of society and contributors to it. Fahad Bshara reminds us how interconnected the region has been to the Indian Ocean, revealing in the process the multiple ties and networks that enriched society. Farah al-Naqib's historical overview of Kuwait captures the easygoingness that came with living in historical Kuwait and how that transformed with modern urban planning, leading to separation of people and a more limited understanding of oneself and the other. Nelida Fukaro, on the other hand, traces the rise of homogeneity as various city-states began to modernize with the help of the British. The AP, or the Arabian Peninsula, has never been isolated. Its kinship to other regions is well established. The peninsula witnessed recurring migration cycles resulting in residency patterns from various ethnicities and geographies, including Indians, Persians, Turks, Blushis, Zanzibaris, and others from East Africa. The fluctuating borders and oscillated identities of the pre-nation state even led scholars to argue for the cultural unity of the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf on the one hand, and the Gulf and Swahili coastlines on the other. And in this slide, there's so much to choose when it comes to trying to prove the religious diversity and the ethnic diversity of the region. On the far right, we have here three Blushi men coming early on in the 19th century into the region. This is an image of the African slave ocean passage in 1868, many of which found homes in the Arabian Peninsula. These are natives from Muscat, coming from different ethnicities. We have here African origin pearl divers who contributed to the well-being of society and the economy. And very curiously, Zanzibari women posing in colorful outfits. I saw other renditions of these colors in other pictures. And this is almost in 1895. Now, in terms of religious diversity, the Arabian Peninsula hosts all Muslim sects, all three Muslim sects, Sunnah, Shia, and Ibadism, as well as Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, and beyond across its history and into the present. Working toward the shared goal of survival and fulfillment of mutual interests resulted in harmonious intercommunal relations and even allowed for coexistence and inclusion in the past. The region's diversity is indisputable. However, the character and the path of this diversity should come under scrutiny, as it ranges from affirmation and plurality to silencing, erasure, and homogeneity. How could this be the case? Let's turn to Michel Rolf Trio and the Subaltern school, who can propose some answers. Haitian academic Michel Rolf Trio defines history in his book, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. He explains history through a binary, meanings A and B. History has a dual explanation. It means both the facts of the matter and a narrative of those facts, both that which happened and that which is said to have happened. Meaning B tends to encroach on meaning A. And I use the Pac-Man analogy for those who remember Pac-Man back in the day. I used to play that game. But the essence is you'll always have conflicting views of what history is. And the dominant view is that which has to have happened. And why is that the case? Because those in meaning B are the more powerful actors in society. The more powerful the narrator, the more probable her version will dominate and become part of the history corpus. That is why the discipline, the history discipline, thrives on power and creates silences in the process. Now, erasure and trivialization are two types of silences. Erasure involves canceling facts from the narrative altogether, as if they did not exist. Choices are made of what history to present and when erasing certain facts. Trivialization, as the term indicates, belittles the weight and value of a piece of information. The historian and any party reassembling history make choices over what evidence to invoke. Different choices, just like asking different questions, lead to different histories on the same topic. And this is the crux of historical production. All historical production is just that. It's historical in relation to its time and space of production. There is no infallible historical authenticity. It is relative and relational. Trio identifies silences across 4 moments of historical production. These moments do not necessarily build upon one another. Think of them as two-way streets, and hence I have the arrows on both sides. They are fluid moments, and they may induce silences collectively as a whole or within a certain stage. These 4 moments are sources, when we're there digging for facts and we're trying to bring out facts into the foreground. Archives, when these facts are assembled and put together, they become archives. And then narratives. How do you retrieve that story, that history, and how do you present it to the other? What choices do you make? And then the last moment is retrospective significance, which is the making of history in the final instance. And that also goes into notions of silence and erasure. Now, historical production, and my fellow historians can vouch to this in the audience, is a complex exercise. It may involve more steps beyond that I've mentioned. What I like about these moments is how it helps you both visualize and disentangle layers of history to detect that which may have been missed, buried, glanced over, overstressed. Compared to silences, the subaltern concept has evoked more controversy and debate. The subaltern was an idea that was proposed by Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, and it first denoted the economically dispossessed. But a careful rereading of Gramsci's prison notebooks expands the range of meaning attributed to the subaltern to include the socially marginalized, the oppressed, and the powerless who are permanently downgraded to this position by elites for the sake of elites propping their power. Now, to be fair to our own context, we cannot wholly transpose a Western concept into a non-Western setting. But we cannot drop helpful constructs if they can be of aid to us, and that's where integrating mental frameworks can help us understand our region in a better way. And that's what I do when I go closer to home to the Indian literary critic, Gayatri Spivak, and her very helpful essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? What Spivak does is she operates through a post-colonial lens, and she reorients the subaltern concept to exclude exclude subdued and oppressed groups or discourses that try to enhance their position from within the system. What does that mean? For example, one could claim that women in our region or religious minorities are not discriminated against because of the presence of a person or more in positions of power. But that is tokenism. What you need is mass empowerment, or else the subaltern status does not go away. So let's bring those two concepts together, erasure and the subaltern. A thin line exists between undergoing a silence and becoming a subaltern. Influenced by Spivak's call for contextualization, I find both silences and erasures in the Arabian Peninsula along a wide spectrum. But to be dubbed a subaltern, there needs to be first a systematic and sustained form of erasure. And second, resistance from the subaltern against the hegemony in place with the intention of overturning it. That is where this Portuguese scholar, Boaventura de Sousa, comes in handy when I try to contribute to a concept that's useful to the Arabian Peninsula. He promoted subaltern cosmopolitanism, which recognizes erasure, all right, but conditions its successful removal by giving agency to those stripped of it as they embark on changing their destiny. For instance, residents of Jewish and African origins have a rich history in the region, and it's being recently rediscovered. Their history has been silenced, but not necessarily erased. On the other hand, when viewed through the Saudi state lens, Saudi Sufis and the Medina's Shiites were until recently, and some argue to date, subalterns who have fought at varying levels against state-imposed impositions. Whether viewed by some in there as unbelievers or of lower status by official Saudi ideology of the recent past, undergoing a subaltern status needs to be contextualized against a specific community at a given time to avoid inaccuracies and generalizations. While varying understandings and practices of Islam dominate the region today, Islam is not the only player in the peninsula's religious arena. The region has long been home for Jews, Christians, and Hindus. Arabia's Jews were mostly based in urban trading centers such as Oman, Bahrain, and Al-Hassa. During the 19th century, many escaped Ottoman wrath to find new homes and a more welcoming society in the Arabian Peninsula, where they practiced their religions without fear of persecution. As opposed to the other religions in the peninsula, the dwindling number of Jews goes back to political rather than purely religious reasons with the establishment of the Zionist entity in 1948. The backlash faced by many Jews in the peninsula as a result led to a small minority remaining in Yemen and Bahrain. On the far left, here, we see, my pointer is not working. Okay. This is a wedding in Yemen, in Umran province, which is 70 kilometers north of Sana'a. It was in 2008. This is a family of Yemeni Jews in another area as well, Raida. And this is the exterior of the Bahrain synagogue that was built in the 1930s and still stands to date. And if any of my students are here when I teach the history of Kuwait, they know that I talk a lot about Saleh and Dawood al-Kuwaiti, who migrated from Shiraz. Their father was born in Shiraz, but then they launched their career from Kuwait and then moved on to Basra and then to the Zionist entity. And since we're on Arabia's Jews, let me also take you through a deep dive into Bahrain. This is Ibrahim Nunu, and he is one of the remaining Jewish members of the Bahraini Jewry. And this is inside the synagogue that I just showed you the picture of. This is a portrait of his family in the 1950s in Bahrain. This is the portrait of another Bahraini Jewish family, the Khadduri family, also in the 1940s and 50s. And this is a Jewish cemetery in Bahrain. Now, British presence in both India and the Arabian Peninsula, coupled with older trading ties with India, facilitated the presence of Hindus, who easily established temples and learning centers in Yemen, Oman, and Bahrain. The United Hindu Society was the umbrella that held these various components together and helped streamline Hindu life in the Arabian Peninsula. It could be argued that British protectorate agreements with regional rulers facilitated the presence of Hindus. Without the British, Indian Hindus would not have had a viable presence in the region. However, this line of reasoning is debatable. The British would not have been able to entrench Hindu presence without the blessing and acceptance of rulers and other elites. In turn, elites would not risk offending locals if they knew that such presence would be objected to. Hindus contributed to the Arabian Peninsula along various fronts, whether as British subjects who enforced security or Indian merchants who supported the local economy. Indians, whether Hindu or not, are not alien to the Arabian Peninsula and continue to play a constructive role. And here I have a picture of a Diwali celebration in the Arabian Peninsula back in the 1960s. It's in the lower bottom. This is a Hindu temple in Aden, Yemen, which still stands to date. This Indian school was established in 1950 in Bahrain. And this is an image of the oldest Hindu temple in the Arabian Peninsula, which is in Bahrain, and it was recently renovated, and hence you see the various colors shining it. Christian missionaries established themselves as early as 1891. Under the guise of opening much-needed hospitals, the presence of missionaries was initially not frowned upon. They used the provision of medical services as the bait to save the souls of Arabia's residents. The missionaries also built churches, but other than a handful of cases, they failed to convert locals. Missionaries, therefore, reoriented their focus to servicing the religious needs of Arab Christians who arrived in larger numbers as the region modernized with the exploration of oil. It is many of these Arab Christians that later became naturalized citizens. And I encourage you all to read a very excellent study by my colleague, Dr. Abdullah Al-Hajri, who also surveys the history of Christianity in Kuwait. In terms of the images, and this will not be a foreign image to many of you, because this is the American hospital, which now houses al-Athar al-Islamiyyah. This was a picture from the 1970s. This was in its earlier days. This is one of the missionaries that founded the Arabia mission, Samuel Zwimmer. And this is an image of the journal that they published for many, many years. It was Neglected Arabia, and then it was changed in its final years to Arabia Calling, and it ended. It ceased producing in 1962. Now, I paint an image of Jews, Hindus, and Christians living at ease in the Arabian Peninsula prior to the coming of independent nation-states. I'm not idealizing the past. I'm full aware that there were issues and challenges, since they were, after all, religious groups trying to find their space and manage their place among Muslim-majority societies. Yet, their status in the post-independence era pales in comparison to the past. Local governments erased this past interreligious presence from their history, replacing it with homogeneity and further limits on other religions, magnifying the Arab-Sunni strand instead. And this is where we move into the homogeneity aspect that was apparent. A slight exception could be said of Oman, and I'm happy to explain why in the Q&A. Now, this homogeneity was displayed on various sites: school curricula, media, religious programming, civil society allocations, and I can name other fields as well. Inculcating a national identity or belonging is presumably easier when identifying with one strand of your identity. But such a sense of belonging will always be fragile, because simply there are other identity elements that you need to abide by. Putting aside other components or asking other religions to form their identity in isolation of the national narrative contradicts the quest for building resilient national societies. Pursuing a national exercise should just be that, national. And that means involving all national components in this exercise, or else it wouldn't be national. Embracing all strands of Islam and non-Muslim belief systems in the conversation is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Post-independence governments were faced with the prospect of becoming a shrinking minority given their own self-identification metrics. That is why they regulated migration flows and severely constrained at times the land grants for new places of worship, burial sites, and educational outlets. They also restricted the ability of others to openly celebrate festivals and organize processions. Practices widely varied in the region, ranging from complete prohibition of public non-Muslim religious practices in Saudi Arabia to guarded acceptance in Oman, Bahrain, and Kuwait. The level of constraints might vary from one city-state to another, but what combines them together is the existence of restrictions. The state became the dominant arbiter on the deliberation of religions, whereas the pre-nation state accommodated various voices, whether it's the religious groups themselves, local elites, traders, the British, and so on. While the general position toward religions has changed from guarded acceptance and coexistence in the past to suspicion and restrictions in the modern era, a current wavering trend is reasserting itself and extending more open arms to non-Muslims in the Arabian Peninsula. This is to the benefit of the large number of Christian and Hindu residents and the small indigenous Christian community. However, in contrast to the past, this cautious opening is not wholly organic. Political reasons, branding, and international pressures have played a bigger role than did a homogeneous local drive. Signs of recent overtures are plenty, and they include the ordination of a Kuwaiti Christian in 1999, a first for the region, the appointment of a Bahraini Jew, Christian, and Hindu to parliament in 2002, which was also a first. If we were to distinguish between the organic and the non-organic, I would say that the appointment of the region's first Kuwaiti Christian, it was an organic process. It wasn't an intervention by the state. These are the members of parliament that joined the Bahraini parliament in 2002. Ali Sam'an is of the Christian community, and Nancy Khadouri is from the Jewish community. Huda Nunu became their first ambassador in DC in 2008. She was the first female ambassador, Arab female ambassador, and also the first Arab Jew. We also saw in the last 2 decades the dedication of Qatar's first church in 2008. And this is the church from the outside. And this is the first mass that took place in 2008. And we also see expansion of churches in the UAE. St. Joseph's Cathedral was one of those in Abu Dhabi. It's one of the oldest Catholic churches, and that's the interior. We also saw, which shows you how lively this activity is, the inauguration a few days ago of the largest Catholic church in the Arabian Peninsula, which is now in Bahrain, and it houses over 2,300 worshippers. And next week, we're going to have the inauguration of yet another church in the UAE, in the area of Al-Ruwais in Abu Dhabi. Added to all of this is also the expansion of diplomatic ties with the Holy See, starting in 1998 with Yemen, followed by Bahrain in 2000, Qatar 2002, and the UAE in 2007. And that was, interestingly, decades after Kuwait established its relationship with the Vatican back in 1968. In this vein, we cannot ignore the Pope's first visit to the Arabian Peninsula, which was to Abu Dhabi in 2019, and that's him delivering his mass and exchanging kisses with the Sheikh of al-Azhar, Ahmed al-Tayyib, and they issued together the Human Fraternity document, along with the plans for opening an Abrahamic complex next year. That Abrahamic complex would be housing worship sites for Jews, Muslims, and Christians face to face. Now, the UAE has particularly invested in this file following them recognizing Hindus and endowing their first temple in 2019, just 2 years ago, and that was all done on the heels of promoting tolerance. That included in the UAE establishing a Ministry of Tolerance, a National Tolerance Program, an International Institute of Tolerance, a Tolerance Award, a Day of Tolerance, and so on. The list continues in the UAE. Oman has developed its unique theological brand, shunning sect-based mosques, while its Ministry of Endowments and Religious Affairs has been publishing its flagship journal, guess what the name is? Tasamuh, or Tolerance, since 2003. And it also focuses on bridging gaps between different religious groups. It changed the name to Tafahum, or Understanding, a few years ago, claiming that Oman has surpassed tolerance and reached the state of understanding among its religious groups. Qatar has also been coming to terms with its own history by founding the Bin Jalmoud House, and this house used to be the center of the sale of slavery in Qatar, in Doha. And what they did was they turned it into a museum that was dedicated to the legacy of slavery in the peninsula. The UAE funded Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies issued in 2016 the Marrakesh Declaration, which seeks to reaffirm equal citizenship as an Islamic principle regardless of one's religious affiliation. And there is also the exponential rise of interreligious dialogue centers in the last decade. Along the UAE forum that I just mentioned, we also have in the UAE the World Muslim Communities Council. In Qatar, we have the Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue. And in Bahrain, the King Hamad Global Center for Interfaith Dialogue and Peaceful Coexistence. Even Saudi Arabia joined the club, with late King Abdullah stressing the importance of religious dialogue and calling for an international conference to that end in 2008, which eventually led to the creation, it's that upper left picture or image, of the King Abdullah International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue, which is now based out of Portugal. Saudi reactions at the time are worth highlighting to underscore the need to engage with plurality bottom up and from within, as opposed to establishing centers alone. The late Saudi monarch's call for dialogue was met with stiff resistance from religious scholars and society at large. The king did not hold the conference in Saudi Arabia. It was held in Spain instead, and the label religion conspicuously dropped from the title of the conference. No official Saudi clerical representation was in attendance as well. Flexing religious diversity muscles abroad amounted to little at home at the time. This stands in stark contrast to transformations underway in Saudi Arabia, whereby the state now is redefining its relationship to religion, but short of adopting a pluralistic attitude, until now at least. The call for religious plurality has its enemies lined up, whether due to misunderstanding the concept or for pure ideological reasons. For example, some former Kuwaiti parliamentarians were against the presence of churches in the Arabian Peninsula. They even beseeched fatwas, religious rulings, that call for a ban on building non-Muslim edifices in the peninsula. The region's various constitutions declare religious equality and freedom for all, but practices on the ground, coupled with contradictory laws, strip these constitutional laws from any meaning. An open attitude towards religious diversity in the past transfigured into an erasure that is now in a murky in-between phase, that of a mediated silence across the peninsula. It's a wavered silence that yields a mix of unsustainable gains. These recent initiatives are elitist and mainly state-led. Deducing from half-hearted measures or incomplete actions, they are not wholly vested in religious inclusion, even if a minority within the various state apparatuses are pushing in that direction. By association, most of the region's residents are either disenchanted or follow the state religious educational dictates that deem one version of Islam superior than the others without contextualizing such a position from within the Islamic tradition. Given this contradiction between lived reality and conflicting state policies, more work is needed to resolve this mishap and reclaim the region's right to reflect and positively build on its religious difference. Religious diversity is an Arabian Peninsula hallmark. The management of this diversity has to be at the heart of discussions and actions of state and society. Bottom line, differences in societies are not really religious. They tend to be over political, economic, and social issues. That's been the course of history, and it goes into the present. The reception of the religious other in the 19th and early 20th centuries was a critical moment, but it was not a watershed one that merited a dramatic pause at the time. It simply happened by default because the followers of these other religions and the societies that hosted them were looking for win-win scenarios where there was mutual benefit for all. The rise of economically more capable states facilitated the promotion of an insular identity to consolidate residents, rallying them behind a new national identity. Religious diversity is no mirage in the region. It is real, and it's always been around. Using it to foster healthier societies only comes when channeling this diversity into plurality. The prospects of a relaxed religious pluralism moved from being around and lived in the past to a set of regulated silences and erasures, to now a mixed or confused amalgam of both. Our current status is reminiscent of an idea that Gramsci talks about a lot, which is the organic crisis. It's the departure from old ideas, but without the new ideas being formed. So now we're stuck in that transitional phase. What are we meant to do in this transitional phase? I think the answer is simple. We need to manage our religious diversity in a way that promotes pluralism. And I'm not talking about an ironclad type management. By management, I'm referring to a holistic, integrative approach that involves top-bottom, but also bottom-up initiatives that bring various parties together to freely express themselves, talk out loud, speak about their religious views, and talk about how their religion is formed in relation to one another. That will lead to better social relations. Discourses and activities aiming for social cohesion and national unity are worthless without profound change from within. And that comes by creating real learning spaces for engaging the other through education, civil society, legal change, cultural exchange, and so on. These are the more difficult reforms that require a lot of work if we want to digest our diversity and use it as a source of strength. Upholders of religions should not fear such an exercise. It will strengthen personal belief systems in the process and bring the best out of people when they know themselves and one another better. Take Sunni-Shiite relations as an example. One would be surprised at how religiously illiterate Sunnis are towards Shiites and vice versa. Take Kuwait as an example. This illiteracy rose to the surface after the terrorist attack of Al-Sadiq Mosque. There was a national outpouring condemning loss of lives. But is emotional support enough? The attack should have midwifed conscious policies that eradicate our religious anemia and lead to profound encounters. Religious diversity can and should incubate healthy social relations and better awareness of oneself and the other. Our real challenge is building stronger societies that engage in and celebrate difference. The Arabian Peninsula is home to more than 50 million residents and over 190 nationalities. It cannot afford a superficial, cosmetic embrace of religious diversity. Thank you for your time.